Hey everybody, I'm Garrett Haake. I'm a Washington correspondent with NBC News and MSNBC, and this is Texas Tribune Fest 2020. We are not in Texas today. I'm sitting in Connecticut, and our guest today, Andrew Yang, is in upstate New York. We've got about 30 minutes for an interview session here. Sadly, we can't do the usual Q&A like we would like, but I'll try to hopefully hit a bunch of different topics and get through a pretty wide range of things here in this 30 minutes. For a little bit of background on Andrew Yang, he's an entrepreneur, he's an author, he's a philanthropist. I think most of America got to know him as a 2020 presidential candidate. He's the founder of a couple different organizations that we'll talk about. Humanity Forward, which is a nonprofit dedicated to promoting a lot of those ideas he campaigned on during his run. He's also the founder of Venture for America, another nonprofit focused on creating jobs in the cities that have been struggling the most to recover from the Great Recession. But as I said, I think most Americans know Andrew Yang as this 2020 candidate who captured the imagination of a lot of people. He ran on a couple of really big, bold, interesting ideas that got people thinking about what government can and should do in a couple of different creative ways. His supporters, many of whom I suspect will be watching today, came to be known as the Yang Gang. I can tell you as someone who covered the Yang campaign periodically, they were outspoken, but unfailingly polite and engaged and involved in the political process. And I hope they're joining us here today. And Andrew, I kind of want to start off on the idea that I think you're probably most associated with, UBI, Universal Basic Income, the Freedom Dividend. I wonder if you're surprised to see those kind of direct payments become national federal policy that's got such wide buy-in as part of the pandemic response.
Thanks, Garrett. It's great to be here. Thank you, Yang Gang. So I'm thinking about how do people know Andrew Yang? It's from the 2020 campaign running on universal basic income. And Garrett, to your point, certainly no one could have wished this awful pandemic on us. Am I surprised that we have gone to cash relief? I'm not, because it's the only common sense, direct and effective way we could actually get economic resources into the hands of tens of millions of American families whose livelihoods have been cut off through no fault of theirs. And if you think about where we are even now as a country, we're down about 12 million jobs from when the pandemic began that we know of. That's an undercount because there are many, many self-employed people who had their own small businesses that are also closing. So if you think about the hairstylists, the massage therapists, the personal trainers, the security guards, the airline attendants, the rental car workers, the hotel workers, the concert promoters, like it just goes on and on through the economy. And unfortunately, the people that are getting kicked to the curb are often the people that had the lowest levels of savings and cushions available in order to manage this kind of downturn. So putting money into their hands was an obvious move. Thank goodness we did it even to the extent we did. We did not do enough of it. It was not big enough or robust enough or regular enough. But any economist who looks at it says that this direct payment plan worked wonders in terms of helping to shore up the financial situation of not just the households involved, but the economy writ large. We just need to keep doing what works. And 55% of Americans right now are for universal basic income in perpetuity. So what started out as my relatively marginal campaign has now become mainstream American thought. And 75% of Americans are for cash relief during the pandemic. So it's common sense. I just wish that Congress did what we all know is the right thing to do.
I'm glad you mentioned the idea that this has caught on. I think a lot about how Bernie Sanders talks about how, in 2016, Medicare for all seemed like this, kind of out there idea, and $15 minimum wage was a crazy liberal bold thing. And now it's part of the Democratic Party platform. Do you think 4 years from now we're looking at universal basic income as a more of a mainstream, either Democratic or just broadly a more mainstream policy idea than it started out as when you started running?
Absolutely. I don't even think it's going to take 4 years, Garrett, because unfortunately we're going to be struggling through this crisis for months and months. 42% of the millions of jobs that we've lost will never come back. So when you look around and figure out what the right approach is going to be, it's going to come to direct cash relief and universal basic income over and over again. Hopefully we'll adopt it well before 2024. There are right now about 50 representatives in the House who've sponsored a $2,000 a month for just about every American approach right now. There's a similar bill in the Senate with Kamala, Bernie, and Ed Markey and some others behind it. So this is the policy of not just the future, but the present. And I would be stunned if it doesn't become part of Democratic orthodoxy well before 2024.
You've scaled up your sort of experiment with this, your test run with this, with Humanity Forward. Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned about how people are using the money that your organization is giving them, and what that's telling you about how this program would really work on a larger scale?
The data that we're getting on cash relief is actually economy-wide, where economists are stunned at how effective it's been in reducing the poverty level and improving household well-being. For us, we've given $8 million to struggling households around the country and counting in increments of between $250 and $3,000. And I will be the first to say that we are not overly concerned with tracking what the tens of thousands of Americans we're giving this money to are doing with it, because we kind of know what they're doing with it. They're paying grocery bills, they're keeping a roof over their head, they're trying to make ends meet. And if you dig into the individual stories, they're heartbreaking, where we hear every day from folks who are losing their homes, who are living out of their car, who are making choices between food and rent. And so we have absolute confidence that putting money into their hands is beneficial to them and the right thing to do. And it's one of the things that I think we are discovering economy-wide, where the $1,200 stimulus, which again was too little and only one time in April, had massive benefits. We're seeing the same thing with the $8 million we're giving away as well.
I guess I'm just curious if it's helping you refine, how much the money needs to be, who needs to get what amounts, if you're playing with the formula at all as you're testing this on a larger scale.
Well, we do have a 5-year trial that will give us better data that is launching this summer in a town called Hudson. And I'd say, Garrett, the single biggest innovation that we are bringing to the marketplace is just showing that our government could be doing much, much more to get resources into families' hands. We use the IRS, which was the best set of pipes that the federal government had available to it. But how do you get money to your friends? You Cash App them, you Venmo them, you PayPal them. We're not exactly sending checks to each other. You know what I mean? I can't remember the last time. So, and that's what we did with Humanity Forward, where we're Cash Apping people money. And if you don't have Cash App or Venmo, you can easily get it. There are a lot of people who reached out to us asking for relief, and we said, hey, most convenient thing is for you to have one of these apps, and then they downloaded it. It takes you like 5 minutes. So why is it that a nonprofit that got started this year can effectively transfer money into the hands of tens of thousands of Americans, and our government can't? Like what's going on with that?
Federal government, yeah.
Why is it that there were thousands of Americans who were stuck on hold, like calling their state unemployment insurance office? Like, it makes zero sense.
Well, those state systems are just so badly broken. You tee up nicely, I think, a question that I'm really interested in, your background in technology. I mean, I think it's interesting because you're an advocate for data privacy. You're involved in the California measures on that topic, but you're also somebody who's, I think, looks pretty creatively at different ways technology can solve social problems and things like that. And I wonder where you come down on things like the tracking apps in terms of the pandemic response. There is technology that's available that in many cases is used in, places like Hong Kong and Taiwan that, I think Americans would look at as infringement upon civil liberties, but is in many cases sort of the high-tech way to do the things that public health officials think we need to do to get control of the pandemic. I wonder, how do you see that balance in terms of using technology on public health issues, especially on the pandemic, while still protecting people's privacy?
Garrett, I love this line of questioning, and there are a couple of different pillars to it. So number one, you're right. I'm for the fact that our data should be ours, even if we're loaning it to these tech companies. And these tech companies are profiting to the tune of $200 billion plus a year off of our data, and we're not seeing a dime of it. And I don't think that's appropriate. And it's not just corrosive in terms of dollars and cents. It's corrosive for our democracy. It's corrosive to our mental health. It's corrosive to our autonomy and decision making because we're becoming, unfortunately, like rats in a maze with like digital bits of cheese pelting our heads.
We don't even know we're in the maze,
Yeah, it's right. We just accept it. We're like, oh, let me log into Facebook. It's free. Like, it must be great.
Right.
So that's set of issues number one. Set of issues number two, which you've described, is if you wanted to get your arms around this pandemic, we would need to be very transparent about what's going on with us, with our family members, with our health. And the public trust in America is too low in many communities in order for people to make use of that. So if you look at some of the international comparisons you make, where you have South Korea or Taiwan or places where this data is being relayed publicly, there's this much higher sense of trust in government and public officials, where the public officials who are saying, look, this is for the public good. You communicate this, we'll communicate it to you, and we're going to get our arms around this virus. And there is a sense of solidarity that we just don't have in the United States of America. And so the issues are tied together, but this erosion or disintegration in our sense of public trust is actually going to make it very, very hard for us to solve a whole host of problems. And it's something that
the technological tools we have available to us. I mean, it's sort of like you have to be at least this tall to ride. Like, you need this much public confidence in the system to use these digital tools that are available.
Yeah, and this is a rough reality, but a lot of people would be more likely to share their data with a tech company, which they're already doing, than with something that was attached to the government, because there's this reflexive big brother resistance to the government trying to do anything with us. And that's not a good state of affairs, that we trust tech companies more than we trust our government. But last I checked, I think Congress's approval rating was something like 11%. So, I mean, it gives you a sense of just how, how negative a lot of Americans are on our ability to get things done. And then, unfortunately, Congress is now verifying that mistrust by not passing the stimulus bill since April, and now it's September. And every American can see that we need additional aid given what's happening to millions of households.
Yeah, my day job is covering Congress, and the House Democrats passed the HEROES Act in May, and we're still waiting on the Senate. And it's become I could sort of play any of my live shots from June or July or August and say basically the same thing about how stuck Congress is. I saw your interview you did with Ro Khanna, Congressman from California, talking about the power of incumbency. And I wonder, if you were going to hack Congress, what would you do differently to try to break that sort of thing up?
I'd love this line of questioning because this to me is the next frontier for me, for the country. What I've started to realize is that you can put different people in the cockpit, but if the machine doesn't work, it doesn't matter. Like, you actually have to fix the machine. And I think one fear we have is that you could cycle different sets of people into DC, but nothing would change. That's a concern that is real. And so what do we need to do to change that? We need to publicly finance elections in a different way, because right now, if you're an incumbent member of Congress, you start out with essentially $1 million cash advantage. And who the heck can raise $1 million to actually give you a contest? Plus, the districts in many cases are quite safe. So public financing is a must. One thing I think we need to make happen is term limits for members of Congress, so that you have some real turnover. Because right now, if you get into Congress, you can stay there for 20, 30 years. The average age of a member of Congress is 62. Not to say that everyone above that age is necessarily, out of touch. But you certainly aren't building a system that encourages legislators to try and get something done for the people and then come home. Unfortunately, it encourages them to just crouch in D.C. So there are some system-wide problems that we have to tackle, and they're not going to be uniformly popular with the folks in D.C. But I've got though ideally they would say, I hate dialing for dollars. Like, please release me from my
Every member
fundraising.
Of Congress says that's like their least favorite thing to do ever. I mean, that's why people leave in many cases, because they spend so much of their time on the phone just asking for money.
Yeah, Lawrence Lessig says it's between 30 and 70% of their time as members of Congress. So instead of governing, you're just calling rich people. And I've called rich people for money. I'm terrible at it, and but I don't recommend it. And so having
okay,
members of Congress become really good at it is a bad look for the country. So one of the ways I think we can fix this is we say, look, past term limits, but then current members of Congress are exempt from those term limits. So it doesn't affect them. And they'll say, well, this just affects the people after me. And then fast forward 12 years, then we'd be in business.
Right. Because the one thing that Congress is not going to do is go out of their way to, circumscribe their own power right now.
Yeah. So they can say, we do this for the future. And then they can stay there until, until someone wrests the seat from their clammy, expiring hands or whatever it is.
That's an image. You're talking about big, not to sound like I'm quoting Elizabeth Warren here, but I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is big structural change, right? I mean, I feel like this is a longer term project, all of this is, than in one election cycle. I mean, I think it starts with education. I mean, I was thinking about this in the context as I was researching the work you're doing in California on the data privacy law. Like, I don't think most people understand how much information about them, whether it's blind or not, is out there and is available. The idea that we hold off on giving it, it's like you're filling out a form. It's like, well, I'm not going to give you that information. It's like a sweet summer child. Like, the information that is available out there about you is so much worse than that. I mean, I feel like the next, is there an Andrew Yang project on the timeline that starts with just education about this? I mean, I feel like your campaign showed a lot of this, but does there need to be the next nonprofit you do need to be focused on just teaching people where we are right now? It feels like we need to sort of set that baseline. I'm not trying to create work for you. I'm just,
question, Garrett. No. So I'm reading Lawrence Lessig's work, and he makes a really interesting point about how if I just sprang a question on an educated American about foreign policy or this or that, like, it's kind of unfair. It's like even if I'm educated, I don't know squat about like what the tech companies are doing with my data unless someone walks me through it. And so we have to do a better job of informing people, but in a way, we're setting an artificially high threshold if we think like all Americans need to be educated about every issue. The better path would be simply having educated legislators, which we don't have on technology issues because we got rid of the Office of Technology Assessment in '95. But I agree with you that right now we're in the worst circumstance where we have different sets of facts, different forms of truth, because we're in information silos and people are getting pitted against each other. One reason why I'm very confident that Prop 24 is going to pass in California is because people instinctively know that right now no one's fighting for their privacy, and that this law, last I checked, it had something like a 75 or 80% approval rating. This is before the tech companies spend millions of dollars trying to hurt it.
Can you give a 3-sentence primer on Prop 24 just for viewers not in California who may not be familiar with it?
Yes, Prop 24 says that your data and privacy rights are actually going to be encoded as law in the state of California, and they're going to create a new data protection agency that then looks out for you and sees to it that you can opt out of geolocation so that they can't tell where you are. It's really getting that nitty gritty at this point. That if they negligently mishandle your information and it gets stolen, that they're liable. So these are some of the changes that they've already implemented in Europe through something called the GDPR. And it has not happened in the United States of America, but California is this close to setting a new national standard for how companies need to handle our data. And I'm so passionate about this because if California adopts this law, then people in Texas and New York and Washington are going to look around and say, why is it that California's data has more protection than mine? Like, are Californians better than Texans? Of course not. And so you would end up with this set of data and privacy rights hopefully sweeping the country.
And are the big tech companies just rolling out everything to fight this, or where do they stand on it?
They're not fans. They don't like it.
Say.
And so this is one reason why I'm so driven on this prop in November, because it's September now, and happily the tech companies haven't really started spending money against it in full force. So I think we've got a real opportunity right now.
I want to talk about November here. I want to talk a little bit about 2020. I've got a couple of things that I want to look sort of forward looking, but I have one backward-looking 2020 question for you in the same spirit as the question about Congress. You were pretty critical during the process of the debate structure, what it took to make a debate, how the debates were run. You know, you talked about how people were spending more time ragging on you for not wearing a tie than they were talking about the ideas. If you were going to build, you know, another system from scratch, if we have another big multi-candidate field in the Democratic Party in 4 years or 8, is there a way to do this better, to sort of surface the best ideas and the best people in a way that you think would be more fair?
I think that we have to take advantage of the fact that technology has evolved since television in the 60s. So we came up with the debates, you know, since whatever, early in the 20th century, and then we televised it. And now we can do things really asynchronously and effectively, something similar to what the New York Times did, where the New York Times took all the candidates and just asked us questions, and you could see how we answered each one. So you could end up with like a catalog of stuff that candidates said, instead of having me get asked, for example, the China question, and I was like, okay, I seem to get a lot of those, and then someone else gets asked a question about healthcare or whatnot. Just ask us all about China and healthcare, and then you can actually have this like compendium. And I think you'd have a lot of citizens who'd be really interested in that, and they would see that you could dig in to our beliefs and policies in a deeper way. And then you could even have the debates as like a live follow-up to various things. You could do creative things where it's like, well, here's what candidate X said about this, and then we can ask him like a second question.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting. I mean, I have a younger brother who's an engineer and doesn't watch like anything I do on TV, engages in politics in a very different way. And like 36 hours before he votes, he's like, okay, I need to know every position everybody's on, and just that's how he engages. And I think you miss people who don't want to follow an 18-month-long political trail to the nominee. They just want to know what people like actually believe on the things that matter to them.
Yeah, the Ballotpedia is a nice resource, at least in terms of generally profiling people, but it doesn't go deep into people's policies. And I always thought the policies were the values. I thought that like the problem right now is that our media coverage ends up favoring conflict. It ends up favoring characters. It ends up favoring, and I felt pressure, Garrett, to kind of fulfill my own caricature, where at first it was like, yeah, it's like, oh look, the magical Asian man who wants to give everyone money. He's like, a tech gazillionaire, ha ha ha, like all this stuff, and it's like, well, like a lot of that's not quite accurate, but
you don't want to be that character.
What was funny is like I actually ended up leaning into some aspects of it because I needed coverage, sure. and so you were just like, well, shoot, like if this will help elevate the campaign, then I guess I'll play along.
Yeah, I mean, I your supporters I know would get mad at my employer from time to time if they felt like we weren't giving you the angle on different things. I think I covered your climate plan rollout, and it was one of those things where it's like, all right, we're going to get 2 live shots in on the climate plan, and then the president's going to say something crazy. And it's like, well, I hope we summarized it well in those first 40 seconds, because that's all you're going to get. I mean, it's got to be a challenge to break through.
Yeah, that dynamic was really powerful on the trail, Garrett, where I got bigfooted many times by the president or other candidates. So
I feel you. I get it.
Yeah, you're like scrambling for coverage, in any way you can.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about something, a quote I read from you recently about Joe Biden. You wrote or said about Joe Biden, you said, the magic of Joe Biden is anything he gets behind becomes the new reasonable. Biden has the potential of being transformative without coming across as transformative. I thought that was really interesting, and I also had no idea what you meant. Can you explain to me how you mean that?
The biggest recent example, Garrett, is when he came out with a $2 trillion plan to address climate change. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, if Bernie had released the self-same plan, people would have said, like, oh, here's like the extreme plan. But then when Joe released it, it was like, yeah, that's reasonable. And it became both very centrist and moderate almost overnight. Something similar kind of happened when he came out for gay marriage equality when he was the Veep. That when Joe decides to get behind something, all of a sudden he drags the entire center with him.
he's laundering big ideas to make them palatable for the center?
He has incredible judgment and instincts where I think by the time he champions something, it's almost like we're all waiting for someone to say, yeah, this is the new reasonable. Of course, gay marriage equality in my mind is like years or decades overdue. Yeah. So, and trying to address climate change, similar. So Joe has this lodestone-like quality that is somewhat unique to him. And when he's the president next year, I believe he's going to propose very big plans that, coming from someone else, you'd think like, this is very ambitious or aggressive, but it's going to be necessary because we're still going to be dealing with this crisis, and millions of Americans are still going to be suffering.
Right. I mean, in climate in particular, it does sort of feel like because of the pandemic, we've taken our eye off the ball. I mean, they're obviously related issues, but it just sort of seems like it's like, oh, we've got 10 years to solve that crisis, or 5. That seems like a ton of time compared to this other horrible thing we're dealing with right now. Do you think there's a long-term cost to the sort of short-term focus on the pandemic away from our other giant ecological threat?
In an ideal world, Garrett, we can solve for both simultaneously by focusing on jobs, really, because that to me is the current crisis for millions and millions of Americans. So if we were to put millions of Americans to work building a more sustainable infrastructure, installing solar panels on buildings around the country, rebuilding our decrepit, crumbling highways and bridges and schools, installing broadband, there's a lot of work to do. And so hopefully we can try and meld the two and help get our arms around climate change. Because if you can imagine what equipping many of our current structures with the right energy infrastructure would take, it would take a lot of labor.
This was supposed to be the great promise of the Trump presidency, right? I mean, even people who didn't support him, he was a builder and he was going to come in and do all this infrastructure work.
At least he'll get infrastructure right. Yeah, no.
Infrastructure week is a running joke now. I mean, it just is. It's totally off the national conversation.
It's one reason why our trust in government has eroded to this point, that our government's not even doing the obvious. Like, we're supposed to coast on the investments of decades ago while they're literally crumbling underneath our feet.
I want to go back to Biden a little bit here and to the 2020 campaign. I'm just curious, I'm always interested in sort of the relationship element of this. How much, when you were running, are you looking over your shoulder at what the other candidates are doing? What are the relationships like? Like, I get the sense that even though policy-wise you guys have a bunch of different ideas, like, it probably wasn't a tough sell for you to say, like, when Biden more or less had this locked up, like, you're going to be with him. I mean, I think of you guys as two fairly amiable people, but talk to me a little bit about what that relationship is like when you're competing, but it's like an intramural scrimmage, right? You all ultimately know you're going to be on the same team in some format.
It was pretty easy for me to get along with folks, Garrett, because no one felt particularly threatened by me at any moment in time.
That probably helps.
But Joe and Kamala
Bill de Blasio didn't threaten anybody. He didn't get along with anybody, though. I mean, it is possible to do this and not have a lot of friends.
Well, part of it, too, is that if you are make or break at a certain point in your campaign, which everyone was, you have people whispering in your ear, hey, you got to throw rocks next time you're on stage. You got to really land some punches. And I thought that was not great guidance, frankly, because everyone can tell exactly what you're doing, and it comes across as really, really contrived and artificial. So Joe was magnanimous and generous to me from day one, when there was really no political benefit to him, when it was just us, in Iowa, and he was the former Veep and I was the unknown, that he would talk to me about the ideas and the issues. And he's been deeply concerned about the impact of technology on the middle class for years, it turns out. He and I had numerous conversations to that effect. So the fact that I was championing this stuff, he actually was cheering me on. He was like, yeah, way to raise attention to this. And Kamala, similarly, when I was unknown, Kamala was extraordinarily gracious and generous, and made sure that we interacted as human beings. So you're right; it was easy to get on board on a personal level.
You were pretty outspoken about wanting to speak at the DNC to sort of bring your supporters along with you in supporting Joe Biden. I mean, do you feel like you have accomplished that. You are accomplishing that. Will the Yang Gang show up for Joe Biden in November?
I can't speak for everyone, but I think a lot of them are coming around. And the truth is, Garrett, if I can't get someone to come around, I still respect that. I mean, sure. I have family members who voted for Trump last time. I don't know how they're going to vote this time. I certainly hope they're going to go with Joe and Kamala this time. But I sense that many of them are warming up to Joe and Kamala, in part because I think Trump has demonstrated to be the wrong person to lead us through a crisis.
If Joe Biden wins and he calls you up in November or December or January and says, I want to find something for you to do in this administration, what would you pitch him on? I mean, could you foresee a role in Washington or out in the States working for this, that administration?
I ran on solving a lot of these problems, Garrett, and if someone like Joe gives me an opportunity to help solve those problems, of course I'll be on board. And the problems I'm most passionate about are trying to humanize the economy for us, for families around the country, universal basic income, obviously, issues related to technology, AI, social media, that are disastrous for our children's mental health. Those issues are things I think I could help speed us up on because our government is decades behind the curve on technology issues in particular. And I think I could help with that.
Let me ask it this way then. Does that job exist or do you need to come in and say, all right, I'm going to be the AI guy and create your own space to address those problems?
No, we've had informal conversations about creating a new technology facing role because it doesn't quite exist right now.
All right. Well, we are basically out of time. This went really fast. I had one other question for you. I mean, having experienced what you've experienced in the arena, do you think running for office is another thing that you could do again? Or do you think you're more effective kind of on the outside or in an appointed role or something like that? I mean, will we see Andrew Yang's name on another ballot at some point?
Garrett, if you think about how I started out this time, running again would be a breeze relative to this time, because when I started out, everyone was like, who, what, what was it talking about? Whereas now, I've got the Yang Gang, I've got, a lot of people that are excited about me. Yeah, we've got the merch, we've got some fun stuff. So I'm very, very determined to do everything I can to solve some of these major problems that are bearing down on us, that are unfortunately getting bigger, not smaller. And if that's as part of Joe's administration, great. If that's running for office again, great. If that's, as a citizen, great. But I'm going to do everything I can. And I'm appreciative to everyone who's given me an opportunity to help. Just now, the fact that we've given $8 million plus to struggling Americans right now, it's a real privilege. And it's because so many people have gotten behind me. And so I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm just going to keep on fighting.
I love it. All right, Andrew Yang, we got to leave it there. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Garrett. And also, shout out to the people in Texas. Donna Imam running in the 31st District, Austin, Texas. It's her against the 78-year-old Republican incumbent, John Carter III. I think you know who needs to win that race. Donna Imam, Texas 31. Pro-universal basic income, and is going to turn Texas blue. So just want to get that plug in there. Always working. I've got a whole set of down-ballot candidates. We have to help win.
Throwing out the endorsements. I love it. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Garrett. Be well.